So to get started with our True Crime tumbler, we're going to base coat our tumbler. So I am using Red Red by Pop of Color, and I am using my paint to apply my glitter. Now you can still use the epoxy method. You would just want to paint your cup, let that dry, and then use your small amount of epoxy to adhere it. However, for me, I'm just going to apply a thicker coat of paint and then dump my glitter directly onto the wet paint. So if you are doing the same method, you do want to make sure you work quick because this paint does dry relatively fast. So I'm just going over and I'm just making sure that I don't have any globs of paint anywhere. And then I'm just going to sprinkle my glitter all over the paint. Then I'll go back and I'll paint the bottom, and I'll do the same thing for the bottom. And then you want to make sure that you do fully let this dry. I usually wait about 30 minutes before moving on to epoxy. Now I'm just going to mix up 15 milliliters each part A and B epoxy, and then I'm going to apply that over my entire tumbler. And then don't forget to use a torch. This will help with any of those micro bubbles, and then I'm going to let that cure. Now before we move on to the next step, you do want to make sure that your cup is completely smooth, so you may need to sand and add an additional layer of epoxy, but just make sure that the cup is fully smooth before we move on to our next step. So now I've got my vinyl and I've already trimmed it to match my tumbler here. And this is a semi-transparent vinyl, which means that the backing is clear. However, our design does have the white backing to it, so you're still able to see it on any color base. So I'm just going to line that up as best I can on my tumbler, and then I'm going to just place that first part down, make sure that it's nice and even. And then I'm going to go around the cup with my squeegee tool and just make sure that I don't have any air bubbles, and that when I am placing this on my tumbler, I am smushing out or popping any of those air bubbles and rolling it completely flat around my tumbler. So if you have a little overhang here and you don't want your design to overlap, what I do is I'm just taking a piece of masking tape and I've lined the masking tape up right along the edge of where my vinyl design is, and then I'm placing the excess over the masking tape. Then I'm just going to trim off right along the edge of the masking tape and just trim off the excess so that it lines completely and perfectly along. Now, if you do have any air bubbles, you can just go in with your weeding tool or your weeding pin and then just make sure you pop any of those air bubbles. Because the needle is so fine, you won't notice the holes that it leaves. So just make the indent and then press down lightly. Now for our drip. So I've already mixed up 5 milliliters each part A and B epoxy, which is plenty enough. This will give us a lot of extra that we don't need, but I don't like working in smaller amounts than that. So I've mixed the epoxy up, and then now I'm just adding in scoops of Nice and Thick. Now this really depends on you. I can't give you an exact number of scoops that I use because I feel it's always different, but just keep mixing and make sure that you do mix thoroughly, that there are no clumps or any excess pieces of the Nice and Thick in your epoxy while you're stirring, and you can just kind of eyeball it and see, get it to the consistency that you'd like. I do tend to add my dispersion color halfway through, and then I'll go back and I'll add more Nice and Thick. When you add your dispersion color to it, it does thicken it up quite a bit, but just keep mixing. If you're working with fast set, which is what I usually recommend, keep in mind that it does fast cure, so you do need to work quickly while doing this, and the longer you let that sit, the more thick that it will become without having to add more Nice and Thick. So I'm just going around the top edge of my cup here and just making a line with it. Now, the more that you add, the more of a drip that you're going to have in certain spots. So I tend to work with a little less first, and then I'll go back around a second time and then add another layer to let those drips really form. Now, if your drips are going too far down, just tilt your cup upside down. That way they start to go back towards the top, and you can play with this as much or as little as you want. Just obviously don't forget, if you leave your cup upside down, to make sure that you turn it back so that your drips don't all form towards the top of your cup. Now you can go in with either a torch or just some alcohol spray and just spritz it so that you don't have any of those micro bubbles, and that is what I'm doing here. And then just for a little extra, I just went in with the same epoxy, and then I just kind of added some blood splatters there too. Now just keep in mind, this was very messy, and when you do this it will likely get everywhere, so don't have anything close by. So for my keychain, I decided to use the same leftover that I had from the Nice and Thick. Now you do have to work quick here because it will start to cure, and it is getting much more thick, so it's harder to spread on. So I just took the same silicone stir stick and I'm just kind of going around as best I can. Now I ended up adding more than I wanted to. I didn't want to fully cover him, but I ended up still going around most of the keychain and then left some spots open for when I apply the glitter next. So you can do this part however you like. If you want to do it in a solid color and just mix up another batch of epoxy, you totally can. I liked this particular method because it made it seem more thick and more stand out than if you were to just use a flat layer of epoxy. Then I just spritzed it with alcohol and let that cure. Once the drips have cured, now I'm just going to mix up, again, 15 milliliters each part A and B epoxy, and I'm going to apply that over my entire tumbler, including the drips. Don't forget the bottom. And then the excess epoxy we're going to use for our knife mold. So we'll get to that next once you cover your cup. And then don't forget again to use the torch just to pop any of those micro bubbles. So for our knife shaker, I'm just taking the same glitter and then I'm mixing that into the epoxy that I had used for the tumbler, and then I'm just going to mix that up. I'm going to spritz the mold with alcohol first, and then I'm just going to pour it over the entire mold. Just make sure that you fill that up to the top, but you don't want to overfill that here, so just go right up to the top and then we'll let that cure. And then with that same mix that I have already, I'm just going to go over the top of my little dude here, and then we're just going to cover him with the glitter so that the back side will be the glitter, and then when you flip him, it will be the red color that we did previously. So I'm just going to go over and fully coat him. Now, because this is just epoxy and glitter and it doesn't have the nice and thick, it is likely going to run if you put too much. However, it's super easy to pop epoxy off of the acrylic. So if you do have some excess epoxy, you can just use your X-Acto knife and just trim that up as needed. So once that has cured, I'm just going to pop that out, and you'll see we're left with the hole here to fill that up with either sprinkles, or you can use what I'm going to use here, which is just alcohol ink. Now, when I did the alcohol ink, I thought it would be a lot more noticeable, but I picked a color that was too close to my glitter already that I had, so it didn't show as good as I wanted it to. So I am just using glycerin here, and then I poured a little bit of that, just enough to fill it up into the mold here. And then you'll see I just did 2 drops of the alcohol ink. Now you can definitely use the sprinkles, which will be more noticeable, which is what I would recommend. If you were going to do the liquid and the alcohol ink like I did here, then I would recommend going with a lighter or like a white colored glitter instead. So to seal it, I'm just using UV resin, and then I'm using the pre-cut film that was included, and I'm just going around the edge of that with my UV resin, and then I'm going to line that up on the mold, place that down, make sure that it is fully stuck to the mold, and then just cure that. I also went back and added a layer of UV resin over the entire top just to make sure that it was fully sealed as well. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I can't wait to see what you create.